Yes, hello guys. How are you?
Dr. Volkov, how are you? Welcome.
Thanks. Hello. Thanks very much. I was on the other one than the Teams and I was waiting. So then I saw that you had sent a Zoom.
Well, I apologize for that. Thank you for waiting and being patient. I was actually commenting I want to give a special shout out to Katie through your office because she is a magician and made things connect. But I imagine that you have to be a master of your schedule, maybe an expert time blocker to not get tempted to dive into your email.
I guess I don't know. I'm not a master at that, but I cannot escape email. So
Yeah.
that's impossible.
I bet it takes a village. Well, sorry we didn't get to connect in Orlando. I'm sure that you were happy to avoid Milton.
I think we were all. Were you there?
I was there. I wrote it out.
So you stayed and you saw the hurricane come in and the water and everything.
Well, in Orlando, being in Central Florida, it wasn't by the time it got to, we weren't in Tampa, but it just came through overnight. And actually Ryan, our executive producer, was there, and we had, kind of made it a family trip to Disney and all of that. But it was just fine. But I don't blame anybody for opting to not fly in. I think you were flying in maybe the evening before, so you probably were like, I'm just going to stay home.
No, I think they canceled the flights. I think no one
Oh,
was
wow. Yeah.
there.
Well,
No, there was no way of getting in there. But yeah, well, nature doesn't always behave.
that's what I hear. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And it's Volkov, correct?
With an F. Volkov. Yes.
Volkov with an F. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for spending time. I do want to be sensitive to your time. I know you're a busy person. I spent the last few days reading about you and your life. And I actually watched another podcast you were on with Tim Ferriss, which I enjoyed, y'all's conversation. But there's a couple things that I wanted to point out in leading up to our first question about who you are as a person, if you don't mind. So first, I learned that you're Mexican-American, born in Mexico. And correct me if I'm wrong. You're a psychiatrist. You went to medical school in Mexico, and I think you did a postdoc at NYU. And some of your work that you're very famous for is along the domain of PET scans and prefrontal cortex activity as related to addiction in the 1980s. I think I saw a paper cited in 1988, one of the seminal publications sort of allowing us to better understand addiction as a disease. And I'm wondering how your personal context, culturally and as a function of your training impacted the area of research you were interested in and how that impacts NIDA today.
Well, I guess it is. You're asking me to, in a way, to try to give an explanation and understanding for my behavior based on where I was born and all of the experiences that I had, which of course impact each one of us differently. And I think that I think at the basis of my interest in science is I'm a very curious person. And I was very curious since I was a child, and I wanted to understand the nature of things and comprehend. And I particularly was fascinated by human behavior and what made people react or feel certain things, and why each one of us was in a way so different, even though we had very common elements. So it was very natural that I would be drawn to science itself. In terms of why did I choose medicine? Well, to me, medicine is the discipline that allows you to get closer to a human being, because it's ultimately that interaction between a person that's suffering from a disease and a doctor that, in principle, you want to trust, that allows for the greatest level of honesty and perspective. So to me, that was one of the issues that I thought was a privilege for physicians to have the capacity of having those interactions with others, and that in itself is an opportunity to be able to understand what makes us ultimately human. So and that was at the basis of my curiosity and interest of what is it that constitutes, what is it in our human brain that makes us who we are, and then if you think about it from the perspective of how do you pose that question, which seems like an impossible question to answer, you've come to realize that diseases and pathological conditions offer us an opportunity to understand how a particular pathology, by influencing the brain, affects behavior. So it gives us an insight of how our brain works. And so to me, I was in at the same time, because we're giving always explanations of what we do things, but there are multiple things and it's complex that may have led a factor that may have led me for choosing addiction. Was in my family. There is a family history of addiction. On my mother's side, there is alcoholism. His father basically was an alcoholic who died of his alcoholism due to suicide. His brother, my mother's brother, also was an alcoholic all his life, and actually lived a long life, and ultimately, but was never able to overcome the alcoholism. And to me, it was a difficult growing up as a medical student and then in psychiatry, because no one in my family will speak about it. And there was this disparate reaction of people. I love my uncle, but nobody dared to speak about him. It was like there's this secrecy in the family. And it
Right.
was very frustrating that there was this intolerance to what appeared to be something he was not able to control, but mistook by everyone as this was his doing. And that's where the whole issue of shame emerged. And even though, and I would see it in my close family, and my mother, who was very close to his brother, still had that sense of not speaking about this, had a sense of shame regarding the alcoholism. And even though she knew that there was a doctor and a psychiatrist and working to understand addiction. So that definitively played a role in me pursuing as the disease process that I wanted to understand addiction, because it made me very aware how a substance, and it says whether it is cocaine, nicotine, alcohol, how can a single substance so dramatically change the behavior of a person in a way that it actually erodes everything else and all of the values that we have as an individual and in our group and family, to sacrifice everything. And it was very difficult to use rational thinking to explain that in any rational way. And it was clear to me also, if you look at other psychiatric diseases, that they share with addiction that sense that you cannot use per se your rational thinking to give an explanation of why someone may be hallucinating or why someone is so depressed that they want to kill themselves. I guess it defies logic of our everyday life, but it's not different from addiction, where someone can take the drug at the expense of losing their family, and it's devastating. And so this whole sense that through my experience, because I can control drugs, or through my experience because I can actually control my mood so that I don't allow myself to go into those dark corners, therefore everyone else has to do it, is very, very naive. And I would say it's equivalent to saying, okay, if this marathon runner can actually run 25 miles without having any problem in 5 hours, it follows that you should be able to do the same. But we don't do that with other physical attributes, but we do it when it comes to our mental, emotional being. If I am able to regulate and control this, ergo everyone else has to do. So this is where it came to me in terms of how powerful the study of drug addiction could be in providing us, an understanding of why. What are the areas of the brain that actually get disrupted in a person that no longer has the ability to self-regulate, that strong desire to take a drug, even though they are aware that it will be very consequential negatively. And that's how I then jump into the whole science of addiction. And I've been working on it since then. I continue to work on it as a researcher, and it is basically fascinating, because out of that research, we basically, the science in general of many people that have been looking at this same question as I have been doing, whether they use laboratory animals or they work with people, that the understanding, it has enlightened our understanding about what motivates us as human in general, and how we make decisions, and why we shift, we can be able to control things in one moment and not the other. So it has expanded our insights into what is it that makes us human, while at the same time giving us a much better perspective about what drug addiction is, and this in turn is valuable to develop treatments, and it's also very, very valuable to help us develop prevention interventions.
Thank you for sharing. I first want to just say that I'm sorry for your loss and your family, but I'm grateful that you chose to share personally, because it's very clear from the outside looking in that the main idea of that experience, and I know that as early in your career, and I think you're fascinated with anatomy, fascinated with medical health, and how that translates into psychiatry, and how that translates into really the maturation of imaging technologies through part of your career, and how you can trace that curiosity, right, to where we are today in terms of unpacking the biology of addiction, which leads me to my first question, or my next question, which is really all about, Dr. Volkow, the bifurcation between recovery science and addiction science. So, as you know, historically, much research has focused on addiction science, in other words, examining the causes and neurobiology of substance use disorders. However, recovery science, studying how people successfully achieve and maintain recovery, is now gaining attention. Why do you believe, or do you believe it's crucial to expand our focus on recovery science, and how might that understanding of a recovery phenomena influence treatment today, treatment approaches, public health strategies, and support systems for those on their journey to sustained wellness? And I choose the word wellness on purpose because I'm trying to big tent definition of recovery, because sometimes, as you're aware, we can get very strict in our definition of what that means to be a person in recovery. I'm just curious what your thoughts on those ideas.
Well, first of all, I support also the whole concept of recovery as the aim to achieve wellness. And I think it has become clear that this is an aspect that we need to embrace in general, in substance use, in addiction, but clearly in other mental illnesses and health conditions. And again, when it comes to the importance of recovery, in many ways, it's actually more complex and more crucial than for other medical conditions. And the reason why, if we look at it from the perspective of addiction, clearly drugs modify your brain. That has been shown repeatedly.
Right.
But as you modify your brain, what happens is your behaviors change.
Right.
And then your interactions with others get modified by that addiction. And that actually gets modified in terms of your capacity to study, or your capacity to hold a job, or your capacity to actually keep relationships, and or making decisions, or engaging, say, for example,
Right.
in activities that are dangerous. And that has a downstream effect. So you start to be rejected, and that leads to isolation, which in turn also leads you to internalize that. And the stigma that emerges from you being someone that takes drugs gets internalized. And so you isolate more and more. And the normal reinforcers, rewards that actually keep you engaged on everyday activity, lose their value. And so there is almost like a downstream cascade effect. The drugs produce these changes. And as your behavior changes, that produces other changes. And you're cascading down this road or mountain. So when we think about, okay, we're going to be treating addiction, and there are many medications for certain addictions, not for others, that are very effective, but they actually help you. They are not the panacea. They actually help you regain the stability that is necessary for you to start to reconstruct your surroundings. Because that, without that reconstruction, your brain can recover, but that isolation will push you towards relapse. So that's why it becomes so incredibly important to consider the elements that are necessary to achieve recovery. And these elements vary from one person to the other, and in a way relate to that concept about what constitutes well-being. And and you can get that one and say, and in the sense of well-being in general, I would say that most of all would include having valuable emotional connections and interactions, which are one of the first ones that goes when you become addicted.
No
So how
doubt.
do you rebuild them? How do you build hope into someone that then can generate a plan of what their life is going to be into the future? Because if you do not have that plan, if there's you basically have nothing and you cannot look at nothing into the future, there's nothing that drives you, then there are not many leverages that you can take to modify change, to have the incentives to change. So recovery is, building up on the capital for recovery, which has very strong linkages to building up social interactions as a key component is crucial. And what we are doing right now is not an area where we have per se focused from the perspective of research, but now because we didn't really have the tools to ask the questions about why are these, for example, social interactions so very important to allow you to achieve recovery. We know that it is extremely important, but what do they do to our brain and to our reactivity as individuals that lead you to actually be so sensitive to it? And that's what now research is working towards. And we are coming to recognize the neurobiological processes underlying something that we give for granted, which is how extraordinarily important it is for us human beings, many other animals too, the social milieu in which we live, being part of something that values us, having a mission that can help that group that we are part of. So that aspect of our social being is crucial for our well-being and certainly crucial for achieving recovery in addiction and other mental illnesses.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. I appreciate you mentioning community, you mentioning relationships. Especially I'm a person in recovery, 14 years. I like to say, for better or for worse, and I'm not, because it's obviously tragic for hundreds of thousands of individuals' lives today. But I was really born. My addiction was born out of the prescription diversion generation of the 2010s, 2010s. Right after that, of course, was the rise of fentanyl and illicit heroin into communities to which maybe weren't participating in them, and at the scale that we saw over the last 10 years. So community absolutely impacted. Stabilization, medical and psychiatric stabilization, like you said, is a foundation. I like how you got to start at that foundation, and the brain will heal. But after that, achieving success really is, I don't want to say dependent, but a key to success absolutely is our ability to continue to interact with people around us to help us be better versions of ourselves, which kind of gets me to effective treatment of today. And I'm going to ask you a controversial question, and Katie might get upset at me afterwards, and that's okay. But, I work for a legacy nonprofit addiction treatment provider in Tennessee. And as such, our history has grown in parallel to psychotherapy growth in the United States. We were founded in the 1960s. So at the time, of course, 12-step programs like Alcoholics Anonymous were pretty much the only vehicle for change. And today, there are elements of 12-step culture that are still ingrained into our program that we're proud of, and many others across the country. But when you think about 12-step programs, having been a cornerstone of addiction treatment for decades, we're all well aware that some critics argue that their spiritual connotation or their approach and the emphasis on abstinence in particular, like we talked about earlier, may not be suitable for everyone, which is okay. Given how maybe evidence-based approaches are emerging today, do you believe that the 12-step model, I should say, or 12-step culture in treatment should continue to play a role in addiction treatment? Or should we be more moving towards other science-based methods? And how does NIDA view the balance between traditional 12-step programs and newer therapeutic approaches in fostering long-term recovery?
Well, I think that the easiest answer is, of course, it should continue to be playing a role in treatment programs. I
Yeah.
mean, 12-step programs help a lot of people. It may not be that they are basically adequate for everyone, and there are people that don't want to go to 12-step programs, don't resonate with them, but they have saved multiple of lives, and you can actually come across, I mean, we all know a lot of people for whom 12-step programs have saved their lives. So I think that we need to stop this whole issue of putting one treatment against the other. In addiction, we don't have many alternative treatments, and we have treatments that work, even though they don't work for every single person. But it's the same in everything on medicine. Not, I mean, very effective medications nowadays that we're speaking of the Ozempics, right? They don't work for every single person. They don't. So what does that mean? We mean we need to have alternatives. And why is it that we don't get concerned about it? Why don't we, in the whole field of diabetes or obesity, we don't say you have to have this or that. We have all of these alternatives. And in addiction, we should have several alternatives so that people can, their therapeutics can be tailored to one another. An aspect that I actually think is very, I've always been very, very intrigued about 12-step programs because they are beneficial for many people, and they are, of course, the whole notion as we learn more that the emphasis in abstinence in some instances deter people to have benefits. That's one. And the other aspect on it is that some of these programs are very categorical and they don't allow for the use of medication. So, which again is something that we have been aiming to provide evidence to show that these are not exclusive to one another, and there's no reason why someone that is on medication like buprenorphine should not be given the benefits that you get in one of the 12-step programs. And I do have encountered patients that want to continue 12-step programs, but they don't want to stop taking their medications. And so they are placed in that position that they shouldn't have of choosing one or the other, when in other areas of medicine, we don't force people to choose one or the other. But an aspect, just in terms of, because it is what we were discussing, that I think there are many valuable components on the 12-step program if you look at it. And that is, it gives you a sense of belonging in a group. You are part of a group that is actually cares for you and that is not judgmental. And also, you're part of a group where your own experiences are to value to the other. So you have that essence of how important our social interactions are. So by being part of a group that respects you and that embraces you, you actually have a very strong, solid reinforcer of a social nature that are so very fundamental and crucial. And that sense that also, which of there is a protection, that sense of you are, for some people, not for others, that someone is taking care of you, and if you follow the whole 12-step program philosophy, you will be okay. That can release anxiety for many, and can actually provide that stability. So that's why, I mean, in my view, it is clearly a program that should continue working. In my view, also at the same time, we need to push the system. We need to provide alternatives to people so that they can, if it doesn't work for them, they can have other interventions, and also open up the possibility of mixing them, just like we do with cancer. We mix multiple treatments, it's not once. The same thing with infectious diseases. We just don't limit to one. And shifting that very categorical, inflexible system that we have for addressing addictions would be very, very valuable and would expand the number of people that could benefit from 12-step programs.
Yeah. I've always explained to people that 12-step culture is a lot like organized religion. You have your different denominations and sects, and so I just want to let you know there's a lot of families, treatment-seeking individuals that listen to our show, and these, how does treatment work? What is recovery? Those are generally the questions that we get, and so I just want to say out loud with the director of NIDA on that, there is no place in our literature that says that you can't be on medications and still participate in 12-step culture, 12-step programs. There are groups and individuals that carry a message of you need to do it this, that, or the other way. And I'm just here to say that, if you're sick, if you're hurting, if you're looking for a place to build community like we're talking about, any 12-step meeting, generally speaking, from around the world is a place that you can call home. I know we just have a few more minutes and just very grateful for your time. I want to talk about the future. So I read through some of the literature on NIDA's website, and one of the areas that was of significant interest to me was your cross-cutting priorities, which you say, should substantially inform your mission over the next 5 years. And I just want to read some of them out loud for those people that don't have them printed out in front of them, highlighted like I do. Train the next generation of scientists, identify and develop approaches to reduce stigma, like we've been talking about, understand sex, sexual orientation, and gender differences, just fascinating. Identify and develop approaches to reduce health disparities, understand interactions between substance use, HIV, and other comorbidities, leverage data science and analytics to understand real-world complexity, and develop personalized interventions informed by people with lived experience. So when you think about the future, Dr. Volkow, I was going to ask you what your favorite cross-cutting priority might be, but maybe what are one or two that you're most excited of that you think will make the largest impact on effectively treating people that experience addiction?
Well, I think that a key component is to keep the science going. So in that respect, I think that training to me is so extraordinarily important because it ensures that there will be a next generation that then will train the next generation and that we will build knowledge because it's the way that civilization advances. I think that a second key area of importance for me is to achieve health equity, because what we're seeing, for example, right now is that finally we have seen a 10% reduction in overdose mortality, and that was in 2023. But if you look at it overall, that actually represents predominantly certain groups. If you look at Black Americans, or you look at Americans that are from Native American origins or Alaska Natives, the mortality is still going up, and it's very, very high, double that of the general population. So which tells me that the initiatives that we're doing that are helping to curb the overdose epidemic are not being distributed equally. And this was also very clear when we were dealing with COVID, and we were seeing how certain groups where basically the mortality was much greater, where in this overdose epidemic, we are seeing exactly the same, and it's actually being exacerbated as the gap enlarges because we're being successful in one group, but it seems like we're neglecting the other. And that's why I would basically pick up those two. If at the essence of all of these issues is I think that you were speaking about well-being, and I think an aspect of well-being is the sense that you are actually not being treated differently from the other, that sort of there is not discrimination. And when you have this type of health disparity, there's no way around it to feel that this is not fair, that you're not given the same opportunities. And this is in and of itself one of the essential factors that makes people more vulnerable to taking drugs and actually develop other challenging problems that are associated with early mortality, like described under the diseases of despair. So we need to address health disparities because they drive diseases of despair. And if we don't address them, we will have also an underlying factor that contributes to continued addiction.
Yeah, like culture, like tradition. One of the things we do here just is disaggregate our data as a function of unique group. So instead of I don't want to use this in layman's terms, instead of ignoring it, now let's identify it and let's try to unpack maybe what parts of treatment need to be more celebrated or more robust for certain individuals or groups. So again, thank you so much for your time. I'm sorry we missed you in Orlando. They say it's the happiest place in the world, but I'm sure you had much to catch up on.
Well, I wanted to go very much. I had everything planned, and then Hurricane came. So it was just very unfortunate. I was
Yeah.
looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, thanks again. Have a great day. And if you get to Nashville, we'll send Katie over. She's in Knoxville, and we'll have a good time. So take care, Dr. Volkow.
Okay, sounds good to me.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.